more than 3,000 years ago, one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world, stood on the shores of the Mediterranean, its harbours filled with ships from a dozen distant kingdoms. It possessed a royal palace of nearly 100 rooms, libraries of thousands of clay tablets, and an alphabet that would quietly change the course of human civilization forever. Merchants, diplomats, scribes, and sailors moved through its streets speaking many languages, carrying goods that had travelled from the far edges of the known world. Then, without warning, it was gone. Consumed by fire so sudden that scribes left their tablets on the shelves, and sailors never returned to port. Archaeologists digging through its ruins discovered desperate letters written in the city's final hours, pleading for help that never came. Tonight, we ask the question that has haunted historians for generations: what truly destroyed the magnificent city of Ugarit? Welcome back, dear travellers through time. If this is your first journey with us, we are so glad you found your way here. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so these quiet stories from the ancient world can continue to reach you. Tonight, we sail together to the shores of the Mediterranean, to a city that was once the crossroads of the ancient world. Brilliant, prosperous, and then, suddenly, inexplicably silent. Before we begin, we would love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and where in the world are you watching from? And here is something to carry with you into the story tonight. Do you think a great civilization can truly vanish in a single lifetime? Settle in, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world come to you. Chapter 1. The City Between Worlds. Along the northern coast of what is now Syria, where the Mediterranean Sea meets a narrow strip of fertile plain, a low mound rises quietly from the earth. Today it is known as Ras Shamra, a name meaning simply the Fennel Headland. But buried beneath its soil lies one of the ancient world's most remarkable cities, a city that once stood at the very crossroads of civilization, where east met west, where the sea met the land, and where countless cultures exchanged words, goods, and ideas across centuries of quiet, ordered life. The discovery of this ancient city came entirely by accident. In the year 1928, a farmer working his field at Ras Shamra guided his plough through the earth and struck something unexpected: the stone threshold of an ancient tomb. Word travelled quickly, and soon a French archaeological mission arrived, led by a scholar named Claude Schaeffer. Beginning in 1929, Schaeffer and his team began carefully lifting the layers of the mound, and what emerged from beneath the soil was extraordinary. The buried ruins of a great Bronze Age port city, silent for more than 3,000 years. The city that Schaeffer uncovered was called Ugarit. It sat approximately 10 kilometers north of modern Latakia, positioned half a mile inland from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Its harbour lay to the west at a sheltered bay known as Minet el Beida, the White Harbour, connected to the main city by a paved road crossing the coastal plain. Together, the city and its harbour formed a single, breathing organism, a place where ships arrived from distant shores and merchants walked dust-covered roads into a city humming with life. Long before Ugarit became a great city, humans had lived on this mound for thousands of years. The earliest traces of habitation reach back to the end of the 8th millennium, before the Common Era. Neolithic peoples who settled this coastal ridge, shaped simple flint tools, and eventually learned to fire the earliest sun-dried pottery. Through the ages that followed, wave after wave of new peoples arrived from the northeast and the east, each leaving their mark in the accumulated soil, a layered record of human presence stretching deeper than memory. By the early second millennium before the Common Era, Ugarit had begun its transformation into a true city-state. Resettled by Amorite peoples around 2000 BCE, the site grew steadily in importance. By approximately 1820 BCE, it had entered the orbit of the great kingdom of Yamhad, becoming a vassal within a widening web of Bronze Age power. Diplomatic ties stretched far as the city of Marifar to the east, whose king Zimri Lim made a recorded state visit to Ugarit around 1770 BCE. A quiet confirmation that this coastal city had already become someone worth visiting. The mound of Ras Shamra itself tells the story of this long accumulation. Archaeologists call such a mound a tell, a word derived from Arabic, describing the artificial hill that forms when generations build upon the ruins of those who came before. Ugarit's tell covers approximately 28 hectares and rises to a height of 20 meters at its highest point. Within those layers of compressed earth and stone lie the collapsed walls, broken pottery, ash and seeds of every era of the city's life. A slow, gentle stratigraphy of human time. Nature had given Ugarit every advantage a city could desire. To the west lay the sheltered harbour. To the north and northeast rose the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, while the Nahar Chbayeb River traced the city's northern edge, and the Orontes lay not far to the east. The fertile coastal plain surrounding the city was covered in olive groves, vineyards, and grain fields. A mountain pass to the east opened a road toward the heart of Syria, and beyond to Mesopotamia. Ugarit sat precisely where the sea, the mountains, the rivers, and the great overland routes converged. Within its walls, Ugarit was organized with quiet purpose. The northeastern Acropolis held two great temples dedicated to the gods, Baal and Dagon, rising on raised platforms above the city. Nearby stood the royal palace, an imposing structure of finely dressed stone, covering around 10,000 square meters, with colonnaded courts, pillared halls, and administrative wings, where palace scribes kept careful records on clay tablets. Below the Acropolis, the residential quarters spread outward through narrow, winding streets, their mud brick and stone houses clustered around central courtyards where families lived, cooked, and prayed. The population that filled those streets was among the most diverse of the ancient world. At its height, the city itself housed between 7,000 and 8,000 souls, while the surrounding kingdom of roughly 150 villages may have supported 25,000 to 35,000 people in total. Among the city's inhabitants were native Canaanite speakers, Hurrian communities from the north and east, Akkadian merchants, Hittite officials and traders from Cyprus and the Aegean. 4 languages were spoken in daily life, and scribes at Ugarit worked in as many as 8 languages and 7 distinct writing systems. Life within Ugarit was sustained not only by trade but by the rich agricultural lands surrounding it. Villagers across the kingdom cultivated wheat, barley, lentils, grapes, and olives. The city's inhabitants ate a Mediterranean diet: bread, fish from the nearby coast, wine, figs, and cheese. They wore tunics of linen in summer and wool in the cooler months, fastened with bronze clasps, and adorned themselves with gold jewelry reflecting both local Ugaritic and Egyptian artistic styles. The city's polytheistic faith centered on Baal, Dagon, El, and Anat, gods whose stories were preserved in tablet after tablet of careful cuneiform script. Ugarit navigated the great political currents of its age with careful skill. It entered the orbit of the Hittite Empire around 1350 BCE, becoming a vassal state under Hittite overlordship, yet it retained remarkable autonomy. Its wealth and strategic importance allowed it to maintain diplomatic ties with Egypt, even while pledging loyalty to Hatti. Its scribes wrote letters to pharaohs. Its merchants sailed to Cyprus. Its rulers received ambassadors from Babylon and the Aegean. Ugarit was not merely a city, it was a bridge between worlds, a still and prosperous place where the great civilizations of the ancient earth quietly met. Yet Ugarit was far more than a beautiful city. It was the beating heart of a vast trading world. And to understand its true greatness, we must follow the ships that crossed the ancient sea to reach its harbour. Chapter 2: The Crossroads of the Ancient World. Ugarit sat at the edge of the sea, where the land of ancient Syria met the quiet, endless blue of the Mediterranean. Its harbour at Minet el-Beida welcomed ships from distant shores, their hulls riding low with cargo from across the known world. A fleet of approximately 100 vessels moved through these waters, carrying goods to and from ports that stretched far beyond the horizon. Here, at this gentle meeting of land and sea, one of the ancient world's most remarkable commercial cities quietly thrived, drawing the wealth of civilizations toward its quays. From the forests of the nearby coastal ranges, timber flowed outward through Ugarit's hands. Cedar, that most prized of ancient woods, had been sought by great kingdoms for millennia. Egypt had imported it since the time of the earliest pharaohs, filling ships with timber for palaces and temples. Solomon would later use it to build his great temple in Jerusalem. Ugarit's merchants carried this precious wood alongside cloth, dyed in deep Tyrian purple, extracted from murex shells gathered along the shore, and bronze ware fashioned in the city's own harbour workshops. Goods that carried the mark of Ugarit across the Mediterranean world. Into Ugarit's harbour arrived the wealth of the wider world. From the island of Cyprus came copper, shaped into the distinctive ox-hide ingots of the late Bronze Age, heavy rectangular slabs weighing 20 to 30 kilograms, their 4 protruding corners designed to rest across the shoulders of a porter. These ingots were produced in the Troodos Mountains of Cyprus, smelted from sulfide ores mined at places like Apliki and Skouryotissa. Paired with the copper came tin, travelling an almost unimaginable distance from the mountains of Afghanistan, passing through Mesopotamia and across the Syrian desert before finally reaching Ugarit's docks. Among the most extraordinary goods passing through Ugarit were those whose journeys measured thousands of kilometers. Lapis lazuli, that deep celestial blue stone flecked with golden pyrite, arrived from the mines of Badakhshan in northeast Afghanistan, the same mines that had been worked since the 7th millennium before the Common Era. Prized as much as gold itself, lapis lazuli was fashioned into amulets, inlays, beads, and sacred objects. Its vivid blue evoked the heavens, its golden specks the light of the sun, making it a stone of profound symbolic weight in every culture whose hands it passed through. From distant African and Nubian territories came ivory, carried along the Nile and across trade routes to reach Levantine ports. Elephant tusks, unworked and pale, arrived alongside Egyptian faience, that luminous artificial stone the Egyptians called jehennet, meaning the gleaming. Composed of crushed quartz fused with alkaline salts, faience glowed turquoise and blue, its surface catching light like a precious gem. It arrived at Ugarit in the forms of beads, scarabs, amulets, small figurines, and ceremonial bowls, each piece a fragment of Egyptian craftsmanship, carried far from the banks of the Nile into the busy markets of the Syrian coast. From across the Aegean, Mycenaean pottery arrived in Ugarit storerooms. Stirrup jars and painted crater fragments, their surfaces decorated with the geometric elegance of mainland Greek workshops. These vessels have been found in virtually every excavated context at Ugarit, in homes, in tombs, in religious spaces. They carried precious scented and herbed oils, used in daily life and in funerary ritual alike. So pervasive was Mycenaean ware at Ugarit that local artisans eventually began producing their own imitations, adopting Aegean ceramic forms as though the distant culture of the Greek mainland had quietly taken root along the Syrian shore. The scale of Ugarit's commerce was considerable. Scholars estimate annual trade flowing through the city at roughly 30 to 40,000 silver shekels each year, a remarkable volume for an ancient city-state. Merchant families such as those of Yabninu, Urtanu, and Rashab Abu formed the commercial backbone of this economy, operating in a careful symbiosis with the palace. They were neither fully servants of the crown nor entirely independent entrepreneurs. Archives recovered from the merchant Urtanu's house contained nearly 550 clay tablets, documenting transactions conducted across the breadth of the known world, from Emar on the Euphrates to the ports of Cyprus and Egypt. Trade in the late Bronze Age was built not on coined money, but on trust and weight. Merchants used standardized weight systems, the shekel and the deben, to measure silver and other metals in transactions. Contracts were recorded on clay tablets, promises sealed in writing across the ancient Near East's lingua franca of Akkadian. Temples and palaces extended credit, maintained debt records, and backed long-distance commerce. The Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey, offered a vivid glimpse into this world, its cargo holding copper and tin ingots in the precise 10-to-1 ratio required for bronze, alongside ivory, glass ingots, gold jewelry, scarabs, and sealed personal belongings. Foreign merchants did not merely pass through Ugarit. Many settled there. Communities from Cyprus, Egypt, the Hittite lands, Hurrian territories, Mycenaean Greece and Assyria established permanent residence within the city's walls. Their presence is evidenced in the archaeology. Cypriot pottery, Mycenaean vessels, Egyptian ivory cosmetic containers, and a terracotta figure of the goddess Hathor have all been recovered from Ugarit's excavated homes. The city eventually enacted laws regulating what foreign residents could own, suggesting that their presence had grown substantial enough to require formal governance. Ugarit had become, in the quiet rhythms of centuries, a city shaped by the world it served. Ugarit's commerce did not flow by sea alone. Land routes threaded the Syrian interior, connecting the city to the wider ancient world through mountain passes and desert roads. To the east, A passage through the coastal ranges opened toward northern Mesopotamia and Babylonia. To the north, routes crossed the Amarnus Mountains into Anatolia and the Hittite heartland. A coastal road ran southward through the Levantine cities toward Egypt. These roads carried donkey caravans loaded with tin from Afghanistan, cedar from the highlands, and goods destined for royal courts from the Nile to the Euphrates. Ugarit was not merely a harbour, it was a convergence of paths across the ancient world. Ugarit's position between the Egyptian and Hittite empires shaped its political life as much as its commerce. Once within Egypt's sphere of influence, the city shifted its allegiance to the Hittite Empire around the mid-14th century, becoming a vassal state under Hittite suzerainty. Yet even as a vassal, Ugarit maintained its web of trade connections with Egypt, Cyprus, and the Aegean, navigating carefully between powers whose rivalry surrounded it on all sides. The city paid tribute, supplied ships, and sent grain, and in return received protection and access to networks that kept its markets rich. The Amarna letters, those clay tablets of ancient diplomatic correspondence, preserve the voices of the rulers who shaped this world. But trade and diplomacy alone do not tell the whole story of Ugarit's greatness. For within its palace walls and temple libraries, its scribes were quietly crafting one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the ancient world. Chapter 3: Tablets, Gods, and the First Alphabet. Somewhere beneath the ancient soil of what is now northern Syria, thousands of clay tablets lay sleeping for over 3,000 years. When archaeologists first uncovered them at Ras Shamra in 1928, they found something remarkable: a writing system unlike any other known from the ancient world. The Ugaritic alphabet, composed of 30 consonantal letters pressed into clay with a wedge-shaped stylus, was born somewhere between 1400 and 1300 BCE. It was an invention born at the crossroads of civilizations where Egypt, Anatolia, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia all cast their long shadows. What made the Ugaritic alphabet so extraordinary was its elegant simplicity. Where Mesopotamian cuneiform required hundreds of complex signs to represent words and syllables, and Egyptian hieroglyphics combined pictograms, logograms, and phonetic elements across thousands of symbols, Ugaritic reduced all of language to just 30 letters, each representing a single consonant sound. The scribes of Ugarit borrowed the wedge-shaped stylus and clay tablet from Mesopotamia, but the symbols themselves carried an entirely different meaning. Written consistently from left to right, the script was streamlined, purposeful, and surprisingly modern in its conception. The Ugaritic alphabet did not exist in isolation. It was the ancestor of a great and spreading family. Its 30 letters, arranged in an alphabetic order beginning with sounds echoing what would become Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daleth, passed directly into the Phoenician script and then into the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. Several letter forms, such as those corresponding to Beit, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Kaf, and Nun, were virtually identical across these traditions. From Ugarit through Phoenicia, through Greece, through Rome, the chain of letters that now forms every modern Western alphabet traces its quiet origins back to clay tablets pressed in a Syrian port city. Approximately 5,000 clay tablets have been recovered from ancient Ugarit across multiple decades of excavation. They emerged from the royal palace, from the archive of the merchant Urtanu, from the coastal site of Ras Ibn Hani, and from scattered deposits throughout the city. Written in 9 languages, including Akkadian, Sumerian, Hittite, Hurrian, and Egyptian, these tablets now rest in institutions from Damascus to London, from the Louvre to the British Museum. Together, they form one of the most complete windows into Bronze Age civilization ever uncovered. A library that the earth itself preserved in silence. The tablets spoke of many things. Some recorded treaties and royal correspondence, letters between Ugaritic kings and the great powers of the age. King Nickmadu II, who ruled from roughly 1350 to 1315 BCE, signed a vassal treaty with the Hittite great king Shuppiluliuma I, binding Ugarit into the Hittite sphere. His successors maintained correspondence with Egyptian pharaohs, requesting craftsmen and receiving lavish diplomatic gifts in return. The last king, Amurapi, ruling from around 1215 BCE, sent desperate letters pleading for grain during a devastating famine. These were not merely administrative records. They were voices of a living civilization. Among all the texts recovered from Ugarit, none carry a deeper mythological resonance than the Baal cycle. 6 clay tablets preserving the story of Baal, the great storm god, and his struggle for cosmic kingship. The narrative opens with Baal's battle against Yam, the sea god, whose tyrannical rule oppressed both gods and mortals. Armed with divine weapons crafted by the craftsman god Kotharwakasis, Baal defeats Yam and casts him down. Rain returns to the land. Order is restored. In the rolling thunder above the Syrian coast, the people of Ugarit heard the voice of their victorious god. Following his victory, Baal commissioned a magnificent palace upon Mount Zephon and was formally crowned before the divine council. Yet peace was short-lived. Mot, the god of death and drought, rose against him. Unable to resist the lord of the underworld, Baal descended into Mot's realm and perished. The land fell dry and still. Then, through the intervention of the goddess Anat and the sun goddess Shamash, Baal was restored to life. When Mot pressed his claim once more, Shamash warned him that El, the father of the gods, would overturn his throne. Mot relented. Rain fell again across the ancient hills. At the center of the Ugaritic pantheon stood El, the bull, the father of mankind, the creator of creatures. Ancient, wise, and patient, El presided over the divine council from a distant throne. He fathered most of the great deities, including Baal, Yam, and Mot, alongside his consort Asherah, whom texts honor as creatress of the gods and mother of approximately 70 divine offspring. Asherah bore the title Lady Atherat of the Sea and was associated with sacred trees, the lion, and the generative forces of nature. Together, El and Asherah formed the deep, still roots from which Ugarit's entire sacred world grew. Beyond the great mythological epics, the tablets of Ugarit preserved other literary treasures. The legend of Keret told of a heroic king's trials and restoration. The tale of Akhat followed the tragic fate of a young hunter hero. The legend of Danelle echoed traditions that would later surface in the Hebrew Bible. Hundreds more tablets recorded the ritual life of the city's great temples, the Temple of Baal and the Temple of Dagon, documenting offering lists, incantations, festival sequences, and the duties of priests whose titles derived from the root meaning holy or set apart. The sacred and the everyday breathed together across the same shelves of clay. The young scribes who gave these tablets their words were themselves the products of a remarkable education. Ugaritic scribal schools trained students in a dual system, first in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the age, and then in the Ugaritic alphabetic script. Students copied lexical lists, practiced model letters, and worked through bilingual exercises that combined both writing traditions. Evidence of their labor survives in tablet archives alongside the corrections of their teachers. The Ugaritic alphabetic curriculum was still emerging, less formally systematized than its Akkadian counterpart, suggesting that this new alphabet, this great simplification, was still finding its place in the ancient world. The archive rooms of Ugarit held correspondence in 9 languages, written in scripts from across the known world: cuneiform, alphabetic cuneiform, Luwian hieroglyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the still undeciphered Cypro-Minoan. Akkadian served as the great diplomatic tongue connecting kingdoms, while Ugaritic carried the myths, the prayers, and the sacred stories of a people. The connections between these ancient religious texts and the later Hebrew Bible run deep. Shared vocabulary, shared poetic structures, shared divine imagery. In the tablets of Ugarit, the distant roots of much that came after can be quietly felt. Yet the very world that had nurtured Ugarit's brilliance, the vast network of kingdoms, trade routes, and shared culture, was beginning, slowly and invisibly, to fracture at its foundations. Chapter 4. The world begins to unravel. Somewhere around 1200 BCE, a stillness fell across the ancient world. The kind that arrives not with silence, but with the slow, creeping absence of things once taken for granted. Ships that had always returned began to linger. Grain that had always arrived began to dwindle. The great interconnected world of the late Bronze Age, woven together by trade, diplomacy, and centuries of cooperation, had entered a long, trembling moment of unraveling. Scholars call it the Bronze Age collapse, a turning of the age so complete that entire civilizations would vanish from the earth. The empires that defined this age were monuments to human ambition. The Hittites commanding Anatolia and the Levant, the Mycenaeans ruling palace-centered kingdoms across Greece and the Aegean, Egypt reigning over vast territories from the Nile to Canaan, Babylon, Assyria, Ugarit, each threaded into the others through trade in copper, tin, timber, and luxury goods. Historian Eric Klein described this network as a small world, dense with connection, where the fall of one great node could cascade through the system with devastating speed. It was a world of remarkable sophistication and of quietly hidden fragility. Into this tightly wound world came the first great tremor. The sky itself began to withhold its rain. Paleoclimatic records drawn from cave formations in Israel, sediment cores from Turkish lakes, and pollen sequences from across the Aegean all tell the same quiet story. Around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean shifted toward prolonged dryness. Tree ring chronologies reveal that around 1198 to 1196 BCE, 3 consecutive years produced almost no growth, seasons of extreme moisture stress that would have devastated crops across the entire region. Fields that had fed cities for generations fell silent beneath hardening soil. The drought was not a brief misfortune. Evidence suggests it endured for decades, reducing rainfall across the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean, for a period some scholars estimate lasted half a century or more. Agricultural output collapsed across entire regions. In the lands surrounding Ugarit, displaced farming families abandoned their fields and sought refuge within the city's walls, swelling its population to perhaps 10,000 souls. King Amurapi of Ugarit wrote with urgency to Egyptian authorities, pleading for grain shipments. The Akkadian word for hunger, biru, appears again and again in the cuneiform correspondence of these desperate years. While the land dried, the great political structures were already beginning to fracture from within. The Hittite Empire, vast and ancient, had been quietly weakening for decades before the final crisis. Dynastic disputes consumed royal attention. Vassal territories in western Anatolia and the Levant pressed for greater independence. Frontier peoples called the Kaska continued to raid and pressure northern borders. Then Assyria, emboldened and expanding, drove its armies toward the Euphrates and the edges of Hittite dominion, claiming territories and trade routes that had long belonged within the Hittite sphere. The empire that had once matched Egypt was running out of room to breathe. Across the Aegean, the magnificent palace states of Mycenaean Greece were meeting their own ends. Between roughly 1250 and 1200 BCE, palace after palace fell, burned, shattered, or simply abandoned. The palace at Thebes was destroyed so thoroughly that the city would not reclaim significance for generations. Mycenae and Tiryns survived in diminished forms. Their once thriving administrative systems dissolved. The elaborate record-keeping of the Linear B script disappeared. The interconnected Aegean palace economy that had linked Greece, the islands, and western Anatolia simply ceased to exist, giving way to scattered village communities and what historians call the Greek Dark Ages. 3 centuries of quiet and largely unrecorded life. The trade networks that had sustained all of these civilizations were quietly strangling. Bronze, the material foundation of late Bronze Age economy and warfare, required both copper and tin, sourced from distant and separate corners of the ancient world. When political fragmentation and conflict severed the long-distance routes that carried tin from the east, bronze production faltered. Workshops reduced their output. Alloys grew thinner. Slowly, iron began to appear as a substitute. Not yet superior in quality, but locally available in ways that tin never was. This shift from bronze to iron, born of scarcity and broken supply chains, would quietly reshape the technology of the ancient world. It was not only drought and broken supply lines that pressed upon these civilizations. Modern scholars, led by figures such as Eric Klein and Joseph Tainter, have argued that the deep cause of the collapse lay in the very sophistication of the system itself. These were palace-centered economies of extraordinary complexity, highly centralized, deeply specialized, dependent on the uninterrupted flow of goods across thousands of miles of sea and land. Scholar Tainter observed that such complexity, once grown beyond a sustainable threshold, becomes its own greatest vulnerability. When serious disturbances arrived, there was no simple resilience to draw upon. Each layer of complexity became another layer of failure. Into this fracturing world came the Sea Peoples, a maritime confederation whose identity remains one of history's enduring mysteries. They were not a single people or nation, but a diverse coalition of raiders, refugees, and displaced groups drawn from the Aegean, western Anatolia, Cyprus, and the central Mediterranean islands. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III, preserved at his great temple at Medinet Habu, identify specific groups among them: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, and others. Their movements coincided with destruction across the eastern Mediterranean, though scholars today view them less as a conquering force and more as a symptom of the wider collapse already underway. Rameses III recorded his confrontations with the Sea Peoples in dramatic relief carvings at Medinet Habu. His Year 8 inscription describes a world already shattered, naming lands that had been destroyed: Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, Alashia. The great Hittite capital Hattusa was gone. Coastal cities across Anatolia and Cyprus lay in ruin. The reliefs depict something more unsettling than a military invasion. They show ox carts laden with women, children, and household goods moving alongside warriors. These were not raiders returning home with plunder. These were entire peoples on the move, driven by collapse, searching for ground that still held. Scholars who have studied the Bronze Age collapse most deeply, Eric Klein, Joseph Tainter, Brandon Drake, and others, have come to agree that no single cause can account for what happened across so many places in so short a time. It was a convergence: drought that starved the fields, earthquakes that shook cities, broken trade routes that silenced the workshops, political fractures that weakened the kingdoms, and displaced peoples pressing against borders that could no longer hold. Each stress compounded the others, arriving in waves too close together for ancient societies to recover between them. The entire interconnected world of the late Bronze Age simply could not sustain so many blows at once. As the wider world fractured around it, Ugarit found itself standing almost alone at the edge of catastrophe. And the desperate voices of its final days have survived to reach us, preserved in baked clay. Chapter 5: The Last Letters of a Dying City. Sometime around 1190 BC, a scribe in the city of Ugarit pressed a stylus into soft clay and began to write. Outside the walls, the sea glittered in the late afternoon light. The city had stood for centuries. A great trading hub on the Syrian coast, where merchants, diplomats, and sailors moved through its stone-paved streets. But something had changed. Word had come of ships, enemy ships. And the king had taken up his correspondence with a kind of quiet desperation that no administrative record could fully conceal. The king who held the stylus, or commanded others to hold it, was Amurapi, the last ruler of Ugarit. He wrote to the king of Alashia, the great copper-rich island known today as Cyprus. The two kingdoms had long maintained a careful relationship, one of diplomatic respect, trade in oil and metal, and formal correspondence in which Ugarit's kings addressed Alashia's rulers as father. It was not a sign of submission, but of protocol. And now, in the final hours of his city, Amurapi turned once more to that old and trusted correspondence. The letter that survived, recorded as RS 1847, carries words that still carry weight across 3,000 years. Amurapi wrote plainly. Enemy ships had arrived. His cities had been burned. Evil things had been done in his country. And then he described his impossible situation. All of his troops and chariots had already been sent to the land of Hatti, fulfilling Ugarit's obligations as a Hittite vassal state. All of his ships were stationed in the land of Lucca, far to the northwest. The country, he wrote, was abandoned to itself. 7 enemy ships had come, and they had inflicted much damage. Al-Ashir was more than a trading partner. For generations it had been one of the recognized great kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean. Its ruler addressed as brother, even by the Egyptian pharaoh. Its identity as Cyprus is now firmly established through archaeology and textual records, though whether it formed a unified kingdom or a coalition of regional elites remains gently debated. When Amurapi reached out, he was reaching toward a neighbor whose copper had once flowed freely into Ugarit's warehouses. The reply from Al-Ashir was measured. Fortify your cities, it advised. Position your troops. Remain resolute. But there was another letter, a more desperate one. Amurapi also wrote to the Hittite viceroy at Carchemish, the great administrative center that governed Hatti's western territories. He had written twice. He had written 3 times. Now he wrote again. Enemy forces had established themselves at Rasu, Ugarit's own port, barely 5 miles from the city walls. Their advance units had already been sent forward toward Ugarit itself. He begged for troops. He begged for chariots. The language is formal, but the urgency beneath it is unmistakable. A city reaching out across the silence for help that had not yet come. The Hittite viceroy did eventually send troops, but they arrived too late. What came next is preserved in a few spare, heartbreaking words. Ugarit had been burned. The city was destroyed. These were not the words of a later historian interpreting ruins. They were written by those who witnessed or learned of the aftermath, words pressed into clay with the same steady hand that had once recorded grain deliveries and diplomatic protocols. The letter served as an official acknowledgement of the end, transmitted to Carchemish after the fires had already done their work. Beneath the ruins, archaeologists would eventually find destruction layers 0.5 meter to a full meter thick. Compacted accumulations of ash, charcoal, shattered mud brick, carbonized wooden beams, pottery fragments, and bronze arrowheads scattered across what had once been floors and courtyards. The layers tell their own quiet story. Among the ruins were tablets still waiting to be fired in their kilns. Working documents caught in the middle of ordinary administrative life, preserved by accident when the fires that destroyed the city transformed their fragile, sun-dried clay into something harder, something that could endure for thousands of years. The vast majority of those tablets were never sent. Thousands of cuneiform records discovered across 9 major deposits throughout the city. In the palace archives, in temples, in private homes, in the libraries of diplomats and merchants, were all found exactly where they had been left. Letters that were written but never dispatched. Correspondence that reached no one. Among them, one final appeal to Carchemish appears to have been drafted for transmission, but never physically sent. Its tone urgent, its format incomplete. The city fell before the words could travel. Human remains were found within the destruction layers as well. 3 mature male skeletons recovered from the ruins. 2 sealed beneath the thick, ashy debris of the final collapse. 1 lying on the floor of a burned room from an earlier phase of destruction. A large charnel house yielded skulls and bones in disarray, mixed with pottery and funerary objects. Fragments of human bone appeared throughout the ruins. What the skeletal evidence suggests is not ambiguous. People were present when the city burned. They did not all escape. The destruction was sudden, and for some, there was nowhere to go. The last datable event at Ugarit is a cuneiform text linked to the reign of the Kassite king Meli-Shipak II, approximately contemporary with the city's destruction. Another tablet confirms that Amurapi was still in correspondence with Bey, an Egyptian official of Queen Tuzret, as late as around 1190 BC. Radiocarbon dating of destruction-level materials, combined with the astronomical identification of an eclipse on January 21, 1192 BC, has helped scholars place the final destruction between 1192 and 1190 BC. Pottery from the destruction layer showed late Helladic ceramic styles, but none of the later varieties. A small, precise detail that helped anchor the end of Ugarit in time. No survivors from Ugarit appear in any known historical record after 1190 BC. No refugees are documented. No community of displaced Ugaritians settled elsewhere and left a trace in foreign archives. The city that had once stood at the crossroads of trade between Egypt, Hatti, Cyprus, and the Aegean simply fell silent. The tablets stopped. The ships stopped. The letters stopped. The site was never resettled. With the fires extinguished and the silence settling over the ruins, Ugarit joined a growing list of fallen civilizations. And its destruction would prove to be not an isolated tragedy, but a signal of something far larger and far more permanent. Chapter 6. The Long Silence, Legacy and Mystery. When the fires of Ugarit finally cooled, the city did not simply fall into ruin. It fell into silence. Unlike nearly every other destroyed city across northern Syria, cities that were quickly resettled, rebuilt, repopulated, Ugarit remained empty for at least 3 centuries. No new walls rose above the old. No fresh hearths were lit among the stones. The harbour at Minet el-Beida, once alive with merchant vessels, grew still. What had been one of the ancient world's great trading cities simply ceased to be, its population of 10,000 vanishing without a clear trace. Scholars have long reflected on why Ugarit never recovered. The city's prosperity had rested on a delicate foundation. A sheltered harbour, a crossroads of trade routes, and the steady flow of goods between the Mediterranean coast and inner Syria. When the great trading networks of the Bronze Age collapsed, that foundation dissolved. Military destruction, the loss of commercial partnerships, environmental drought, and the withdrawal of powerful allies all converged at once. No single blow destroyed Ugarit. Rather, it was overwhelmed by the slow, quiet failure of everything that had once made it thrive. Ugarit was not entirely alone in its abandonment. The great Hittite capital of Hattusa shared a similar fate. By around 1180 BCE, that city too lay in ruin, its royal administration having withdrawn before the final fires consumed it. For centuries afterward, Hattusa stood largely deserted, visited only by wind and time. The Mycenaean palace centres, Pylos, Mycenae, Medea, burned and fell within the same generation. Populations scattered into smaller settlements or countryside villages. The grand architecture of the Bronze Age crumbled without hands to maintain it, and the world those cities had sustained quietly unravelled. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the collapse left deep marks on literacy, trade, and population. Writing systems vanished. The linear B script of the Mycenaeans disappeared entirely, leaving no scribes to carry it forward. Long-distance commerce halted as the great port cities fell silent. Urban populations retreated from walled cities into scattered hamlets and isolated villages. The rich exchange of goods, Ideas, craftspeople, and languages that had connected Egypt, the Hittites, Cyprus, and the Aegean simply ceased. What followed is called, for good reason, a dark age. Not because nothing survived, but because so much of what had flourished was quietly extinguished. Egypt endured, but it too was transformed. After the reign of Ramesses III, a succession of brief and weakened pharaohs struggled against drought, falling Nile floods, famine, and internal corruption. Temples accumulated vast landholdings, draining royal authority towards the priesthood. By the reign of Ramesses II, the last pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, Egypt had fractured into competing power centers. The new kingdom's imperial age ended not in sudden catastrophe, but in a long, slow diminishment. Egypt survived where others did not, protected by the Nile's reliable floods and a resilient bureaucratic structure. But it emerged from the collapse a diminished and altered world. Into the vacuum left by empire, new peoples quietly rose. Along the Levantine coast, Canaanite communities who had survived the upheaval reorganized themselves, intensifying their focus on maritime trade and coastal settlements. These were the people the Greeks would come to call Phoenicians. They inherited the language, religious traditions, and seafaring knowledge of their Bronze Age ancestors, but they built something new with it. A network of independent city-states centered on Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, sustained by skilled shipbuilding, purple dye, cedar timber, and an extraordinary gift they would share with the world: a refined alphabetic script. The Phoenician alphabet carried within it a distant echo of Ugarit, though scholars clarify that the Phoenician script descended directly from the Proto-Sinaitic tradition rather than from the Ugaritic alphabet itself. Both traditions arose from the same broad Semitic impulse: the desire to reduce the complex to the elegant, to capture the sounds of human language in a small set of simple signs. The Ugaritic alphabet had done this brilliantly within its time. The Phoenician alphabet would carry the idea further, spreading across the Mediterranean through merchant ships and trading colonies, planting the seed of what would become the Greek, Latin, and ultimately modern alphabets. In the highlands of Canaan, another people emerged from the upheaval. The Israelites, a Canaanite-derived population, coalesced in the wake of Egyptian withdrawal and imperial collapse, gradually developing a tribal confederation that would eventually become a kingdom. The Arameans, Semitic tribes from the Syrian highlands, expanded across Syria and Mesopotamia as Assyrian power temporarily receded. New identities, new political forms, and new cultural traditions filled the spaces where the great Bronze Age powers had once stood. The collapse had not ended history. It had, after a long and difficult silence, begun a new chapter of it. The rediscovery of Ugarit began with a plough and a buried stone. In 1928, a peasant in northern Syria struck an ancient tomb roof while working his field at Ras Shamra. French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer led systematic excavations beginning in 1929, uncovering a royal palace of over 2 acres, monumental temples, elite residences, royal tombs, and, most remarkably, more than 5,000 cuneiform tablets stored across 9 major archives. The tablets were written in a previously unknown language, Ugaritic, whose decipherment revealed an extraordinary window into Bronze Age civilization, Canaanite mythology, and the origins of biblical tradition. What those tablets revealed reshaped scholarship in profound ways. The Ugaritic texts demonstrated that Canaan itself, not distant Mesopotamia, provided the most direct cultural and religious context for understanding ancient Israel. Ugaritic words appeared nearly letter for letter identical to biblical Hebrew vocabulary. The myths, ritual texts, and divine epithets of Ugarit's pantheon illuminated the religious world within which early Israelite faith developed. Over 5,000 tablets have been translated and published. Around 100 more await study in museum storerooms. Each one a fragment of a world that ended abruptly, preserved by the same fires that destroyed the city that created them. Many mysteries remain. The identity of those who destroyed Ugarit is still debated. The fate of its 10,000 inhabitants, whether killed, enslaved, or fled, leaves no clear evidence behind. The reason for its extraordinary 3-century abandonment, unlike any neighboring city, is unexplained. Portions of the palace archives remain only partially deciphered. The full geographic extent of the kingdom is still being mapped. Ongoing excavations where conflict has not suspended them continue to refine understanding season by season. Ugarit yields its secrets slowly, patiently, as ancient things tend to do. And so Ugarit rests beneath the Syrian earth once more, its stones patient, its tablets still whispering, waiting for the questions we have not yet thought to ask.